And we're going to move on to a brief presentation by Bruce Patterson. I'll introduce the whole entry point team here now, and Bruce will speak for a while, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. We've got, I'm pleased that we're able to get Jeff Christensen, who's the president and CEO of Entry Point, Devin Cox, who's the executive vice president for business development, and Bruce Patterson, who is the, I guess, the newest member of the Entry Point team, but he is a veteran of this model. And we're really pleased to have him here. He was previously the IT director in Ammon, Idaho, which was the first deployment of the Entry Point network. And we talked about it in that video. So he brings the perspective of the community. He was at the tip of the spear for the project in Ammon, and now he is working with Entry Point to help other communities develop their own version of what is sometimes referred to as the Ammon model, but it's basically, you know, we named it the Community Empowerment Network Model, but I think you'll get a sense and already have a sense of what we're talking about here. So Bruce, I'll give you the mic, and then we'll move to some Q&A and discussion after that.
Thank you, Mitch. I appreciate that. And I wanted to start by thanking you and your team. There's a lot of work in putting something like this together, so I appreciate that very much. And I appreciate everybody's time. So let me just kind of outline what I've been asked to do here as we dig in. I've been asked to talk about my history as we built this out in Ammon, with a focus on significant lessons that I learned as we went through that process in building an automated open access system. And then to also talk about the work that we're currently doing to move the model along and push more mature aspects of open access out to the end users. I've been asked to speak about that. And then we're going to focus on questions. And I think the questions are the part I want to get to. So I'm going to try and move through this content here in a pretty rapid fashion. So appreciate your attention. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Got a few slides to help focus the discussion here. So as Mitch mentioned, I started with the City of Ammon in 2004. In 2006, I took over as the technology director for the city. And about 2007, 2008, City Council tasked me with the assignment of improving broadband access and costs within the city. They felt that we were a little more rural. We're a neighborhood community to a larger area, metro, more suburban area, Idaho Falls, and prices were different in Idaho Falls than they were in Ammon for businesses, even though we're just separated by a road. So they had asked me to take that on as a focus and try and help them determine how best to change the broadband access and affordability within the City of Ammon. So as I worked on that, I became responsible for a strategy to help the city do that. That moved me down the path of having to become familiar with the legal aspects, what it is that the city could and could not do, help them draft ordinance, resolutions, and policies as we moved through the process over a decade. We looked at various financing options, public options, and we ended up using an improvement district. We looked at revenue bonds and a number of different things. I also had to become familiar with design, what the architecture of the fiber system would be, how we would operate it, how flexible we could make it, and what it would mean to try and introduce new services. Those were all considerations I was responsible for. We intended to outsource the construction, but as we moved down that path, it became apparent that using in-house staff from Public Works, we could build this infrastructure at a greatly reduced cost for the residents. And so it ended up that as we started to build in 2016 to the home, prior to that, we had used contractors to do all work. We actually purchased equipment, hired people, trained people, and started to take on construction to the home as part of our fiber to the home effort. That was unforeseen, but ended up to work out best for the end users. We had to stand up a production system and have providers, subscribers, and be able to separate the operations of the infrastructure the actual services, and be able to do that in a way that was transparent to the end user, so that when they had issues, they knew who to call to address those issues. And as we worked through this process, We applied for a lot of grants. We were successful in getting a couple of National Science Foundation grants that helped us with advanced some technologies. And Ammon's also been successful in getting some COVID grants to deliver emergency Wi-Fi network to some key public points within Ammon that was helpful to some of the residents in connecting their children or to be able to do some work from home things. So we did manage some of those things. So that's my background and experience. I wanted to just outline what I learned as I went through this process. I think one of the first comments I would make is we intuitively know this. That's that the infrastructure is a natural monopoly, meaning once we put in this wireline infrastructure, the cost to enter that market and overbuild is dramatic. And you basically divide the subscriber base each and every time you add another wireline infrastructure, which drives the cost up for all of the users within the system. And so it became important to us, the city of Ammon, early on, that it was open access as a result, that it was open to all providers, that we did not encourage multiple overbuilds as a way to achieve choice or competition, because it didn't match with our second priority, which was affordability. The second thing I learned was that the digital divide really that we have today, the gaps, is really a result of the current models. And I think that I'm not going to talk a lot about that because I think that was very well summarized in the video you just watched. We saw the situations that created those models and how they're unable to address needs for ubiquity and affordability. Something else that was very important that started to happen around 2010 through 2013 is that all services started to move to Ethernet IP, meaning that people started to take video and voice services over the top using their internet connection, which meant that a system that was dynamic and could support multiple IP services was important. And so we focused on that. We also could see as a result of that, that unbundling was being driven by customer demand. It was a natural effect of the IP marketplaces that were being created on the internet, and that it would continue, and that any model we developed needed to be sustainable, recognizing that we would see this pattern continue based on customer demand. We also saw that fiber optic, as was well described in the video, was the only sound investment that would take the city 50 plus years. Certainly there are technologies like wireless and others that require less of an upfront investment, but the city intended to hold this infrastructure for decades. And because of that, fiber was the clear-cut winner when it comes to making that investment. We also had to dig in and take a look at the authority that the city had within the state of Idaho to finance, construct, own, and operate such an infrastructure. And those, from a legal perspective, are all specific grants of authority, meaning that in some states you might have the authority to do one of these things, like finance it, but you might not have the authority to operate it or own it after it's built. So these are important aspects that have to be considered for each and every community as they move forward. But we see a number of communities across the country, including in Michigan, where there are some hoops that a community has to jump through. We're seeing communities jump through those hoops and start to build their own infrastructure. The other thing that we saw was that the private model for return on investment wasn't adequate. And this was also pointed out in the video, that stretching the investment model to a public model, which will involve longer timeframes, lower interest rates for construction of the infrastructure, really changes the end price or the cost for the consumer. So if we use that public money to build infrastructure, then that infrastructure needs to remain public infrastructure and open to all. And we also made the decision that being symmetrical, meaning that upload speeds are equal to the download speeds. We could see that that was shifting. COVID actually dramatically proved that this was the case as people moved to online education and online meetings. Their upload speeds increased 4 times faster than their download speeds by most surveys as a result of COVID. So those were things that we felt were important that affected our decisions moving forward. So those are some key lessons learned. If I were to summarize what I think is the most significant, this is what I would say. Public
strategy and leadership have been missing over the last decade. That's due to a number of reasons, and I won't go into those in detail, but it is very important that we recognize that this is the case. Why is it important that public strategy and leadership have been missing, and why is it critical that we get it? Well, I think it's important to frame that question in your mind by asking each of you, where do you want your community to be in 20 years? Think about the broadband availability and the services you expect to see over the next 20 years in your lifetime in your community. Will everything be over the top on the internet, or do you see very robust connectivity that you're not always aware of where the endpoints are, but you get the data and the services that you want on time and without problems? So as you think about that, what would you expect to cost for it, or pay for it, I should say? What should it cost? Would you expect to pay for all of these things piecemeal, a la carte, at a very high price? Or would you expect to have access to these things and be able to get them on demand as you wanted them at a very reasonable and low price once the infrastructure is paid for? So as you think about that, you might think about the strategy that your incumbent providers have. Where did they want your community to be in 20 years? Their business models dictate that they want to be your monopoly provider, and that incentive is correct. Commercially, that's exactly the right incentive for them and the right model. But the question remains, does that strategy align with your community strategy? And if the answer is no, how can you create a strategy that provides for the community's outcome and still respects the investment that's been made by the incumbents? And that's really where leadership can come in, is recognizing that there is a place for everybody at the table, but leadership dictates that we set the table and we let each of the stakeholders decide where they want to sit at the table. And a successful strategy would accommodate for those things. So in June of 2021, just a few months ago, I left my position at the city of Ammon and started with Entry Point Networks. My sole purpose in doing so was to try and help communities across the country take the funding that's available and build public infrastructure. Again, the core belief is from our part is that public money should result in public infrastructure. We now recognize we're at a point where private providers are saying we can't fill in these gaps without public assistance. If we grant them public assistance, it should be used to create public infrastructure that's open to all providers. So at Entry Point, I'm responsible to help with broadband planning, help advise on legal aspects, and find legal experts that can help a community go through how to establish a framework that fits within the state law that will allow them to finance, build, and operate some broadband infrastructure that would serve their community. I'm also responsible to help with network architecture and selection of contractors or equipment. We can do, I've helped communities with that, and we can do that if it's necessary, or simply point the community down the right path and let them do those exercises themselves. I also have experience, as was mentioned, in trying to understand the stakeholders, that having the community be the operator and the owner of the infrastructure, what that responsibility looks like, what are the costs involved with maintenance and operation of the infrastructure. How do we entice providers, service providers, to come into this open system and compete? And then how do we make sure the subscriber understands what he's paying for and how to get help when he has problems? All of these things are new aspects in open access platforms, but they are things that we have solutions for, and there are strategies that can be implemented that will make them successful. And finally, at Entry Point, we're tracking all of the federal programs that are trickling through the state, from the recovery plan funding to other federal programs like the infrastructure bill that we're all waiting anxiously to see passed into law. So current work focus at Entry Point Networks is developing those broadband master plans for communities. We're engaged with quite a number of them across the country, and we'd be happy to help anyone that wants to do that. There are other entities as well out there that can help you with that. And you have fantastic resources in the state of Michigan, in Mitch and Merit Networks and your economic development agencies who are all participating in this. They're here in the meeting today. And Michigan has tremendous resources that if you're a community stakeholder, encourage you to reach out to those people and leverage those educational opportunities. For us at Entry Point and our automated software, we're working on improving the tools that are available to the stakeholders. We're implementing speed test functionality between the various network segments that would be available to everyone, from the provider to the operator to the subscriber. What that means in a practical application is the subscriber can tell if his fiber is up or down, and can tell if he has a problem with his connection to the internet or a connection with his home network or his Wi-Fi. So these are important tools for an open access system, and we are working on those, and we'll be releasing those new tools over the next few months. We're also have developed what we call a service provider in a box application. This is something that an ISP can use. So if an ISP has bandwidth they'd like to sell into a community, but struggles with automating the onboarding of a subscriber through the Entry Point system, because when that subscriber clicks in the Entry Point system, that link, and wants to subscribe, there is automation required on the part of the ISP. And if the ISP is challenged with that technical aspect, we basically have a solution that we call an ISP in a box that we can implement for them that will take care of that automation. And it gives them control over their bandwidth and how that gets provisioned to the end user. We are also focused at Entry Point on transactive energy and hospital from at home types of technologies. We believe those will benefit from private network links. You saw a demonstration of that in the video of how Entry Point enables that. We're automating that even further and making it possible for transactive energy to not take place across internet networks, but instead across a private network owned by the power company. We've demonstrated that in the lab, and we're working on implementing some of these installations in the US today, and hope to be able to push them forward as good examples of a superior way to do business for a power company or for a community that's interested in implementing transactive energy. The same thing would be true with the local hospital, being able to send patients home earlier. There have been studies performed where patient devices and sent home earlier, and it amounts to significant cost savings, and those devices are connected across the internet to the hospital. We're taking those devices and connecting them across the local fiber infrastructure so that they don't actually cross the internet, which improves security and reliability and the cost actually for both the hospital and the patient. So those are things that we're working on developing. That gives you some idea of our current work. So we've outlined kind of the history that led us to the point we're at. We've talked about important lessons that we've learned, we feel that we've learned along the way, and our current work.